The ballroom glowed with soft golden light. Crystal chandeliers hung like stars above tables covered in white linens and fresh flowers. I stood near the entrance for a moment in my simple navy dress, holding a small gift box, feeling the familiar weight of being on the outside of my own family celebration. I was 33, an ER doctor who spent most nights saving lives in the chaos of Denver General, yet tonight I felt invisible again. My stepsister, Victoria, moved through the room like she owned it. Her white gown caught every light, and her laugh rose above the soft music and clinking glasses. She had always known how to command attention. I found a seat near the end of one long table and sat quietly, hoping to pass through the evening without drawing focus. The dinner service began. Plates of carefully plated food arrived, and conversations flowed around me. I smiled politely when relatives nodded in my direction, but most eyes stayed on Victoria and her groom, Ethan. He seemed kind enough, steady and calm in a way that contrasted with Victoria's bright energy. Then Victoria stood up. She tapped her glass with a spoon, and the room gradually quieted. She smiled brightly, waving her hand toward me. "Everyone, I want to introduce someone special to Ethan's family," she announced, her voice carrying across the tables. "Come here for a second, Sophia." I felt the shift in attention as dozens of eyes turned toward me. I stood and walked over, keeping my steps measured. Victoria placed a hand on my shoulder, her smile warm on the surface, but carrying that familiar edge I had known since we were teenagers. "This," she said, gesturing toward me with theatrical flair, "is my stepsister, Sophia." She paused just long enough for the room to lean in. "She's just a doctor." A few polite chuckles rippled through the tables. Someone murmured, "Oh, that's nice." I felt the familiar sting rise in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. I had learned long ago that defending myself against Victoria only gave her more power. So I simply smiled. The conversation around us resumed. Glasses clinked again. Someone changed the subject to the upcoming honeymoon in Santorini. I thought the moment had passed. But then, across the table, Ethan's father, a distinguished man with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, stopped eating. He set his fork down slowly and stared directly at me. Not casually, not politely. He studied my face with deep concentration, as if searching through memories. The table continued talking around us, but his gaze remained fixed. Ethan noticed the change in his father's expression. "Dad, everything okay?" The older man nodded slightly, but his eyes never left me. "Yes, I'm fine," he said quietly. Then he leaned forward a little. "I'm sorry, but have we met somewhere before?" The question hung in the air. The chatter around the table softened. Victoria laughed lightly, trying to brush it off. "Oh, don't worry about Sophia. She spends most of her time in hospitals. You probably just saw her in scrub somewhere." More polite chuckles followed, but Ethan's father didn't smile. He continued looking at me thoughtfully, rubbing his chin. "Strange," he murmured. "I feel like I've seen you during a very important moment in my life." The table grew quieter. Even Victoria paused, her confident smile faltering for the briefest second. I met his gaze calmly. "I meet a lot of people through my work," I said gently. He nodded slowly, still searching his memory. The band in the background began playing a new song, and several guests stood to dance, shifting the energy of the room. But Ethan's father remained seated a moment longer, his eyes still on me. "I'm sure of one thing," he said quietly as he finally rose. "We definitely met somewhere important." Then he walked toward the dance floor. For the rest of the evening, I kept wondering what moment he was trying to remember, and why the memory seemed to carry such weight. The music swelled as more guests moved to the dance floor. I returned to my seat at the end of the long table, the weight of Victoria's words still lingering like smoke in the air. "Just a doctor." The phrase echoed in my mind, familiar and heavy. I had heard variations of it for years. Growing up in the same house after my mother married Victoria's father, our lives had always run on parallel tracks that rarely touched. Victoria received private schools, summer trips to Europe, and a wardrobe that changed with every season. I worked part-time through college, then poured myself into medical school and residency, often studying until the early hours while the house slept. My father had passed away when I was young, leaving my mother to navigate a new marriage and a new daughter who demanded the spotlight. I never resented the differences openly. Medicine gave my life purpose. In the ER, every shift felt meaningful, holding someone's hand through pain, making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But Victoria had always measured success by appearances and status. To her, my scrubs and long hours made me small. Tonight was no different. As the dancing continued, Victoria moved gracefully across the floor with Ethan, her laughter rising above the music. She glanced toward me once or twice, that same bright smile on her face. I knew what it meant. She enjoyed reminding everyone of the gap between us. I sipped my water and watched the room. Ethan's family seemed warm and close-knit. His mother laughed with relatives, and his younger brother, a quiet college student, sat nearby scrolling through his phone. They looked like people who valued substance over show. But Ethan's father remained distracted. Even from across the room, I caught him glancing in my direction while he stood near the dance floor. His expression was thoughtful, almost troubled, as if a memory was slowly surfacing and refusing to be ignored. Victoria returned to the table during a break in the music, flushed and glowing. She sat down beside Ethan and immediately launched into stories about their upcoming honeymoon. Santorini at sunset, she said dreamily. Then Rome. We deserve something unforgettable after all the planning. Guests smiled and offered congratulations. Someone raised a glass. I stayed quiet, offering only a polite nod when eyes turned my way. Then Victoria turned toward me again, her voice carrying that playful edge. Sophia works such crazy hours, you know. She barely has time for a life outside the hospital. Isn't that right, sis? A few people chuckled softly. I met her gaze and smiled gently. The ER keeps me busy, I said simply. But I love what I do. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. See? Always so dedicated. But come on, you should live a little. Travel. Have fun. Not everyone wants to spend their nights saving strangers. The words landed with the precision of someone who had practiced them for years. I felt the familiar ache, not quite anger, but a deep tiredness. I had chosen this path because it mattered, because in the worst moments of people's lives, someone needed to stay calm and fight for them. Yet here, in this glittering room, my work was reduced to something small and ordinary. Ethan's father returned to the table during the next song break. He sat down heavily, his eyes finding mine again. This time the look was more focused, as if pieces were beginning to connect. Sophia, he said, his voice low but clear enough for those nearby to hear. You mentioned you work at Denver General? Yes, I replied. He nodded slowly, rubbing his chin. 3 years ago, there was a massive pileup on the highway. Dozens of cars. Chaos everywhere. The table quieted a little. Victoria frowned slightly, sensing the shift. The older man continued, his gaze never leaving me. My youngest son was in one of those cars. Critical condition. Most of the staff were delayed because of the protests downtown that night. The roads were blocked. He paused, emotion thickening his voice. For hours, there was only one doctor who stayed behind and fought to keep him alive. The room around us seemed to hold its breath. I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my face calm. Ethan's father leaned forward slightly. Was that you? The table fell into a heavy silence. The music from the band continued in the background, but it felt distant, muffled, as if the entire room had narrowed to the space between Ethan's father and me. Victoria's smile faltered. She shifted in her seat, suddenly aware that the attention had slipped away from her. Ethan leaned forward, confused. Dad, what are you talking about? The older man didn't look at his son. His eyes stayed on me, steady and filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. 3 years ago, he continued, voice low but clear, there was a terrible multi-car pileup on I-25. One of the worst the city had seen in years. My youngest son, Tyler, was driving home from college. A truck lost control in the rain. Multiple vehicles collided. Tyler was trapped and badly injured. Internal bleeding, collapsed lung, broken ribs. The paramedics got him to Denver General, but the emergency room was overwhelmed. A massive protest downtown had blocked the main roads. Most of the trauma team and on-call doctors were stuck in traffic for hours. He paused, swallowing hard as the memory surfaced. Only one doctor stayed behind in the chaos. She worked alone for nearly 3 hours, stabilizing Tyler when his vitals kept crashing. She performed an emergency chest tube insertion right there in the bay because his lung was collapsing. She monitored every beat, talked to him constantly to keep him conscious, made critical decisions that kept him alive until the full team finally arrived. The older man's voice thickened with emotion. "That doctor was you, Sophia." The table went completely still. Someone's glass clinked softly against a plate. Victoria's face drained of color. She stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap. The memory of that night came rushing back. The sirens, the blood, the desperate rhythm of monitors, the way Tyler's young face had looked up at me through pain and fear. I had been the only attending physician available. I stayed because walking away wasn't an option. "I was just doing my job," I said softly, breaking the silence. Ethan's father shook his head firmly. "No. You did far more than that." The trauma surgeon who arrived later told me that if you hadn't made those decisions exactly when you did, my son would not have survived. Tyler is alive today, finishing his degree, planning his own future because of you. Mark looked at me in stunned silence. "You saved my little brother." Guests nearby had stopped their conversations. Several leaned in, listening. The woman beside Victoria covered her mouth, eyes wide. The laughter that had followed Victoria's earlier joke had completely vanished. Victoria tried to recover. "Well, that's wonderful," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "Sophia has always been dedicated." But the words sounded hollow now. The same people who had chuckled politely when she called me just a doctor now looked at me with a different kind of respect, quiet, almost reverent. Ethan's father continued, his voice carrying across the table with calm authority. "You introduced your sister as just a doctor, Victoria. But that title doesn't capture what she does. She stands in rooms where people are fighting for their lives. She makes decisions in seconds that most of us couldn't make in days. And that night, she saved my son when no one else could reach him." He turned back to me, eyes shining with gratitude. "I never got the chance to thank you properly back then. The hospital was chaotic, and you disappeared into another emergency before I could speak with you. But I never forgot your face, or your voice telling Tyler to keep breathing." I felt warmth rise in my chest, not from pride, but from the simple recognition that someone had finally seen the weight of the work I carried every day. The band started playing again, but fewer people stood to dance. The energy in the room had shifted. Guests whispered among themselves. A few even nodded toward me with small, respectful smiles. Victoria sat unusually still, her perfect smile gone. For the first time that night, she avoided looking directly at me. And in that quiet, unexpected moment, the truth had done what no argument ever could. It had been heard. The weight of the revelation settled over the table like a heavy curtain. Guests who had been laughing moments earlier now sat in stunned silence. Even the clinking of glasses and distant music seemed subdued, as if the room itself recognized the shift. Ethan's father continued speaking, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Tyler was only 19 at the time. He was bleeding internally, his lung collapsing. The paramedics brought him in, but the trauma team was still stuck on the blocked roads. For nearly 3 hours, it was just you and a handful of nurses. You made the call to insert the chest tube yourself. You stayed at his side, talking to him, keeping him conscious when his blood pressure kept dropping. The surgeon who finally arrived told me later that your decisions bought the critical time Tyler needed. He looked directly at me, eyes glistening. "If you had stepped away even once, my son would not be alive today. He graduated last spring. He's planning to propose to his girlfriend next month. None of that would be happening without you." I felt a quiet warmth spread through my chest, not from pride, but from the simple acknowledgement that someone had finally seen the invisible weight I carried every shift. I was just doing what any doctor would have done in that moment, I said gently. No, Ethan's father replied firmly. Not every doctor stays when the room is falling apart and backup is hours away. You did. Victoria sat frozen beside Ethan, her face pale. The confident glow she had worn all evening had dimmed. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers tightly interlaced. For the first time, she had nothing clever to say. The same woman who had introduced me as just a doctor now looked small under the weight of her own words. Ethan reached across the table and took my hand briefly, his grip sincere. Thank you, Sophia. I mean that. Tyler is my little brother. I can't imagine this family without him. Several guests nearby nodded, whispering among themselves. An older woman at the next table shook her head slowly, glancing at Victoria with quiet disapproval. The laughter that had followed my stepsister's earlier joke had completely evaporated, replaced by a new kind of respect directed toward me. Victoria tried to recover, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Well, that's incredible. Sophia has always been very dedicated to her work. Her voice sounded thin now, almost fragile. The playful tone she had used to mock me earlier had vanished. Ethan's father turned toward her, his expression calm but pointed. You introduced her as just a doctor, Victoria. But that title doesn't begin to describe what she does. She stands between people and death when the rest of the world is delayed or distracted. She makes decisions in seconds that most of us couldn't make in a lifetime. Tonight you laughed at that. But without doctors like Sophia, many of us wouldn't be sitting here celebrating at all. The table remained silent. No one moved to change the subject. No one offered polite laughter to smooth things over. I felt the eyes on me, not with pity or amusement, but with genuine regard. For years I had accepted being the quiet one, the stepsister who worked long hours while Victoria shone in the spotlight. Tonight, the spotlight had shifted, not because I sought it, but because truth had finally stepped forward. Victoria avoided my gaze. She reached for her champagne glass, but her hand trembled slightly. For the first time in many years, she looked uncertain in her own moment. Ethan's father raised his glass slowly toward me. To Sophia, he said quietly, for the lives she saves when no one else can. A few others at the table joined him, lifting their glasses. The gesture was simple, but it carried more weight than any toast Victoria had received that night. As the band began playing again, the reception slowly resumed its rhythm. People returned to dancing and conversation, but the energy had changed. Guests glanced at me with small, respectful nods. Victoria remained unusually quiet for the rest of the evening, her earlier confidence replaced by a heavy silence. And in that quiet turning of the tide, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, but a deep, steady peace. The truth had spoken, and for once it had been heard. The rest of the evening unfolded like a dream I had never expected to live. The music continued, guests danced and laughed, but the atmosphere around our table had shifted permanently. People who had chuckled at Victoria's earlier joke now offered me small, respectful nods whenever our eyes met. A few even came over to quietly thank me or share brief stories of their own experiences with emergency care. Ethan's father remained warm and sincere. He told me more about Tyler, how the young man had recovered fully and was now thriving. He still talks about the doctor who wouldn't let him give up, he said softly. I never thought I'd meet you again, especially not like this. I smiled gently. I'm glad he's doing well. That's all that matters. Victoria stayed unusually quiet. She smiled when guests approached her, but the brightness had left her eyes. For the first time in years, she avoided looking directly at me. Her perfect wedding reception had been interrupted by a truth she could not control or spin. The woman who had always thrived on being the center of attention now sat in the shadow of her own words. Ethan remained kind and gracious. He thanked me again before the night ended, his handshake firm and genuine. Your family now in more ways than one, he said. Thank you for being there when my brother needed someone most. As the reception wound down and guests began to leave, I slipped out quietly through a side entrance. The cool night air felt refreshing against my skin. I stood for a moment under the stars, breathing deeply, letting the events of the evening settle. Years of being the quiet stepsister, the one who worked long hours while Victoria collected praise and spotlight, had taught me patience. I had never sought recognition. I simply showed up for the people who needed me most, often when no one else could. Tonight, that quiet dedication had spoken louder than any glamorous dress or clever toast. I thought about my mother, who had tried so hard to blend our two families. She had always encouraged me to be understanding, to let Victoria shine. But my father's memory, though distant, had taught me something different. Real value is not measured by how loudly you announce yourself, but by how steadily you show up when it matters. A few minutes later, Victoria stepped outside. She spotted me and hesitated, then walked over slowly. For once, her usual confidence was absent. "Sophia," she began, voice softer than I had heard in years. "I didn't know about Ethan's brother. I didn't mean—" I raised a hand gently, stopping her. "You didn't know because you never asked. You never wanted to know what my days actually looked like. That's okay. But words have weight, Victoria, especially when they're used to diminish someone else." She looked down at her hands, the sparkling ring on her finger catching the light. I was nervous. It was my night. I wanted everything to be perfect. "Perfect doesn't require putting someone else down," I said quietly. "I'm happy for you and Ethan. Truly. But I won't apologize for who I am or what I do." She nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time, she seemed to see me, not as the lesser stepsister, but as a person with her own strength and purpose. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I offered her a small, genuine smile. "Thank you." We stood there for a moment longer, the distance between us feeling both smaller and clearer than before. Then I turned and walked toward my car. Driving home through the quiet Denver streets, I thought about the night 3 years ago. The chaos, the fear in a young man's eyes, the steady rhythm of monitors and decisions made under pressure. I had never sought thanks for that night. I had simply done what needed to be done. But tonight, that unseen work had finally been seen. And in that quiet recognition, I felt something deep and lasting settle inside me. Real value is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives in scrubs at 2 a.m. when the world is falling apart. And sometimes, the loudest moments in life are not shouts of revenge, but the gentle unfolding of truth when it is finally allowed to speak. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the peaceful dark. Tomorrow I would return to the ER. Tomorrow I would show up again for whoever needed me. And I would do it with my head held high, not because of what happened at the wedding, but because I had always known my worth, even when no one else did.